This happened almost 10 years ago now. I was a 12-year-old girl, a typical tomboy. My friends were mostly guys, a couple of years older. I was pretty confident in myself too, and wasn't one to steer out of trouble if I was with my friends. One day in the middle of June, I was walking home from my stop. It was like a 5 or 10 minute walk, but nothing too far for a kid my age. I remember the sun was setting, so it was starting to get dark, but wasn't too dark yet. Since it was June, most people were off the streets too, either on holiday or just at home, so I was walking home alone at this point. The street itself wasn't very well lit, but in my mind, it was okay since A, it was the shortest route home, B, it wasn't really dark outside, and C, one of my friends gave me a butterfly knife. A really cheap knife, but I was feeling badass and well prepared. I was walking, totally spaced out, when suddenly I felt someone grab me. For a second, I thought it was a friend who happened to just walk by and scare me, but I remember feeling something was off at that point. The hands that were holding me were not those of a 14 or 15-year-old boy, but more manly, and one of them was trying to reach into my t-shirt. And then I felt a chill when I heard the man speak. He said in my native tongue, "Behave, you little whore." I remember that he somewhat slurred the words too. Not that he was drunk, but as if he was on drugs or just plain crazy, and that his breath just stank of real bad milk. I started struggling, desperately trying to get free from his arms, and I don't think that I've ever been more terrified. I managed to reach with one of my hands to my cargo shorts that had many pockets and deep ones at that, but managed to grab a knife at this point. He tried to tug at my hand and I almost dropped my weapon, and in that split second, I was convinced that I was about to end up dead. I managed to grab it though and didn't even open it all the way and stabbed the man in his thigh. I doubt I made any actual damage to him, but it definitely startled him enough so that he loosened his grip. I managed to wriggle free and started running for my dear life straight home. He was swearing at me and I could hear his footsteps behind me at one point. I felt the need to turn around, but I didn't give in because I was frightened that if I did turn around, I'd see how close he actually was and maybe trip over or something. Not to mention that he probably had my knife at this point. I managed to turn to the door to my home and I pretty much crashed into it. But luck was definitely on my side because I managed to unlock the door to the apartment building pretty quickly and I just ran upstairs. To this day, almost 10 years ago, I have this reoccurring nightmare. I notice someone looking at me and I feel in my gut that he has bad intentions, so I run and he runs after me. It's always the same route as the actual event too, and it's always the same footsteps, and I always almost smash my face in the front door and just desperately try to find my key to open it. Anyway, I was pretty lucky to get away that day. I know that much. I decided to backpack across Russia after college by myself. It was a country that I'd been intrigued by ever since I was an exchange student in college to China, and not far from the Russian border. I'd always wanted to ride the Trans-Siberian Railway, so at age 22, I found myself riding the longest train ride in the world, 6 days from Moscow to Vladivostok. I spoke no Russian, and I knew no one in and nothing about the place. Since I backpacked across China previously and usually had no problems finding accommodations in new cities at any hour of the day when I was there, I figured how hard could it be to just land there and find my way around. In my train car, I made the acquaintance of a young couple who were from that place. Katie was a thin, petite brunette who worked as a scientist, vaguely similar to Bjork in appearance, and told me that she was of partial gypsy ancestry. She was 27, and her husband Vlad was a big bruiser of a guy, in his mid-40s, with chipped front teeth and scars on his face, who had been a professional Russian soccer player. Only Katie spoke English, so it didn't seem out of place to me that she seemed much more interested in talking to me than Vlad did. Still, there were times when I just got a strange, vaguely hostile vibe from Vlad. Also, I chalked this up to language and cultural differences at the time, but It did strike me in passing as odd that Katie seemed to be enjoying talking to me in a way, and with a frequency that I would have expected her to be talking to a partner like, rather than a man that she just met. She got surprisingly personal with me, and I learned that this was her second marriage and that she was the type of person to never show her anger to someone who had wronged her but never forgot or forgave either. Again, I didn't think much of it. When we reached the place, Katie and Vlad were much taken aback to hear that I didn't have any preset accommodations and didn't know anyone there. They were not at all keen on my plan of just wandering the city for a place to stay. It's a crime-ridden city, they warned, and the few hotels that there are quite expensive. No, I just had to come and stay with them for the 4 days until my train left for Harbin, China. But they apparently lived with Katie's mother, whom Katie told me would be happy to cook for me and would be delighted to meet someone from so far away. At this point, nothing felt off. I found Russians in general to be frosty on the surface, but with even a little bit of persistence, they open up and can be among the most warm and hospitable people anywhere. Katie lived with her parents and Katie's sister and young niece in a drab but spacious old Soviet housing block. There were always people around, and all of Katie's family and friends seemed intrigued to meet an American guy. My presence was definitely the talk of the neighborhood, and over the next few days, all sorts of people came over to try and practice their English with me, and the food and drink flowed. This was helped by the fact that Katie seemed overly eager to be in my presence and translate for me at every turn. One night, she showed me a Russian cartoon movie she'd loved as a child and sat next to me through the whole movie, just translating it line by line for me. I woke up the day that my train was supposed to leave, and the apartment was just surprisingly quiet for the first time. I got dressed and walked around, and I soon found that the only other person in the apartment was Katie. She was lounging in a chair in the living room, the TV in front of her. She had on only a thin silk robe that barely covered her and had her legs spread wide apart. She looked up at me and said hi in barely a whisper and had a look on her face that was absolutely neutral. I just stood there slack-jawed and really nervous, and not quite knowing how to proceed. I was a fairly sheltered and innocent kid with less than amazing social skills, but at the same time, I was very much an adult male. And it sure looked as if she was offering herself to me, but not entirely unambiguously. For some reason, I just couldn't shake the very real consideration that making a move on her could be precariously disastrous, especially if I was seeing something that wasn't really there. She could, after all, just be scantily dressed because she forgot that there was someone else in the house. But before I could resolve this drama, the front door opened loudly. It was Vlad. Katie gave a start, pulled her robe together, and said something surprised to him in Russian. He replied, and though I didn't understand him, he seemed to have an edge to his voice that just sent a chill through me. While they talked, I took the opportunity to wander into the bedroom that they had loaned me and do some reading just to distract myself. Katie dropped me at the train station by herself that evening and seemed truly sad to see me go, though she did say one thing that bothered me and seemed really out of place. She said, "You're like a child." She then kissed me on the cheek unexpectedly and bid me goodbye. It's been 16 years since this happened, and I've thought about it every now and then, and I shudder to think what might have happened to me if I had woken up that day thinking and acting much more instinctively. Also, was that whole situation just a trap that I narrowly missed stepping into? The whole thing just felt too planned. The way that there was no one but Katie in the apartment, only that morning, and that Vlad came back just at the time that he did. I'm still not sure what happened that day, but I'm sure glad that I didn't take Katie up on her offer. I was 23 years old, in grad school working towards my MLIS and working part-time at the West Valley Library. I wasn't paid much at West Valley, so I applied for a position at the largest Stone River library system, and was hired there. The new position required me to work hours at the Crestmont and Cherry Lane branches, but I continued working at West Valley too. My first shift with Stone River Library System was a Monday night at the Cherry Lane branch. I didn't need much training because I was already familiar with the software they used and working with the public one, but one of my co-workers was explaining some of the unique policies this library had when a patron came up and asked where he could find some books about World War II. My co-worker asked if I could handle the question, and I said that I could. But before the co-worker walked away, he jokingly said to the patron, "Take it easy on her, she's new." The patron was heavy-set and looked to be in his mid to late 40s, I'd say. I told him that he'd want to look at the 940s in the adult non-fiction section, and he wandered away, but several minutes later, he came back. He said that he was having trouble finding the section and that maybe I could help him find the specific book that he wanted. I started searching our system for the title that he requested, and he then introduced himself to me as Jim and extended his hand over the desk to shake my hand. I awkwardly shook his hand and went back to searching for the book. He was acting overly familiar with me and was very talkative, telling me about himself and all that. Patrons being overly familiar and talkative isn't really that unusual in public libraries, to be honest. Often, people come to the library just to have someone to talk to, so we're conditioned to listen to people talk as we work, as long as it doesn't interfere with providing assistance to other patrons. Unfortunately, we didn't own the title that he was looking for, but I told him that I could place a hold on it and have it sent here from another library. I placed the hold, and I told him that he would get a phone call when the book arrived here for him. He then told me that the phone number on his account was his home phone number, but he would prefer that we call his cell phone. He said that he didn't want to do that because his wife wants calls about her books at home. He then suggested that, instead, I could take his cell phone number and call him personally when his books arrive. I told him that I couldn't do that because I don't handle the items arriving from other libraries, and I'm only here very part-time hours. He attempted a sad puppy dog face and said, "Come on, please, for me." I told him the best that I could do was change the phone number on his account to his cell phone, and he declined and didn't press this issue any further. He then asked if I could show him to the 940s in adult non-fiction. I walked across the library to the non-40 section with him, and I don't remember our exact conversation in the stacks, but he was clearly trying to flirt with me, and at some point, he said something along the lines of, "You look so young, but you seem really to know what you're doing. It's hard to believe that you're new here." I told him that I'm new to this library system, but I've worked at another library nearby for several months, and I also worked in another branch of this library system. He then dropped all pretense of looking for World War II books and started grilling me with personal questions. I sidestepped the questions as best as I could and completely made up the few things I did tell him, but I've always had trouble politely disengaging from uncomfortable conversations like this. After 15 minutes, I told him that the library was really busy tonight and I needed to get back to the circulation desk. As I turned to walk out of the aisle, he grabbed my wrist to stop me, held it very tightly and said, "You should give me your number." I was completely shaken that he had touched me, and I wasn't concerned about being polite anymore, and I semi-screamed, "No, I'm not interested," and yanked my arm out of his grasp. I power-walked back to the circulation desk and into the staff room, where I then caught shit from the supervisor on duty for disappearing for almost 20 minutes. By the time that my chat with the supervisor was over, Jim had left the library. I quickly went back to the computer where I had placed the hold for him, opened the transaction log and opened his library account from there, and I wrote down his card number, his full name and his address. The next day was my first day of work at the Crestmont branch. It was uneventful, and Thursday I worked at the Crestmont branch again. When I arrived, the supervisor told me that someone called looking for me on Wednesday but didn't want to leave a message. I had no idea who it could have been and just kind of shrugged it off at the time. Later that day, my co-worker told me that there was someone on the phone for me. I picked up the call and It was Jim. He said that he was just calling to talk, and this had the hair on the back of my neck standing up because I realized that he must have been the person who called looking for me yesterday. I told him that I can't just talk to people on the phone while I'm at work and not to call here again. He said if I gave him my cell phone number that he would call me when I'm not at work and then we would talk. I told him again that I was not interested and I hung up the phone. The supervisor overheard this too, and I explained what happened at the Cherry Lane branch, and she wrote up an incident report about everything, which she sent to the director of SRLS and the supervisors at all 4 branches. Friday afternoon, the director of SRLS called me at home. He told me that Jim had apparently called all 4 branches on Wednesday and showed up at one branch trying to find me and asking where and when I would be working next. The director emailed me a letter drafted by SRLS lawyers and that he planned to send Jim and asked me to read it over to make sure everything was accurate. The letter summarized the incidences from Cherry Lane on Monday and Crestmont on Thursday, warned Jim that library patrons are not permitted to interfere with a library employee while she is performing her duties, and went on to say, if it were not apparent from the employee's tone of voice, I want to make it clear that your personal attention directed to her is unwanted. It is expected that you will not continue to seek out interactions with this employee. All future interactions you have with library employees will be based upon library services and will not become personal. Failure to comply with this warning will result in you being banned from the library system for a period of time, commensurate with your misconduct. I told the director that I thought that this might be a little bit harsh because I could just be overreacting about the whole situation, but he said that everything about Jim's interactions with me had been completely inappropriate and he wanted to stop it in its tracks. And so I agreed that he should send the letter. On Sunday, I worked at the West Valley Library, and shortly after the library opened, I answered a phone call and it was Jim. I was shocked and a bit scared because I never told him that I worked at this library. He said that he really wanted to see me and that if I wouldn't talk on the phone, he would come to the library and we could talk in person. I wanted to be completely clear at this point, so I told him that I was sorry if I gave him the wrong impression, but I'm not interested in talking to him on the phone or in person or ever again at all. He started saying things like, I thought you were a good person. You seem so nice. You shouldn't treat me like this. I said that I had to go and just hung up the phone. My co-worker who overheard the conversation convinced me to file a police report, just in case at this point. The police arrived shortly after that, and I sat down with them and just went over everything. They told me that they were going to stop by Jim's house the next day to speak with him about the situation and see where things stand, and that if I see him following me anywhere that I should call 911 immediately. Monday night, I worked at the Cherry Lane branch again, and I was kind of nervous that Jim might come in since he knew that I would be working there, and because he had probably just received a warning letter from my boss and a visit from the cops, but he didn't show up, thankfully. My co-workers and I walked to the staff parking lot together after closing too, and as we approached our cars, I saw that my car's hood was popped. When we got closer, I saw that all 4 windows plus the front and rear windshields had been smashed in. There were also dozens of deep dents to the metal panels and cracks and holes just punched through the bumpers and other plastic sections of my car. And inside, it looked like someone had poured bleach just all over the black cloth seats. But before I could even process what I was looking at, my legs just stopped supporting me. I collapsed on top of the blacktop and I just immediately threw up. This was the first and only time in my life that I've experienced an actual panic attack. My co-workers hoisted me back up and half ran and half dragged me back into the library where they called 911. When the police arrived, I told them about Jim. They located Jim's car several blocks away, and inside it, they found empty bleach containers, a hammer and a full set of his clothing, shoes, socks, pants, underwear, a shirt and a sweater. When they visited his house, his wife told the police that he was at a local bar watching a football game. Strangely enough though, The police were just never able to locate Jim. And as far as I understand, he just never returned to his house or his wife after that. I didn't stick around to find out though, and after the next 2 days I quit both of my jobs and just dropped out of school and broke my apartment lease, and I just moved several hundred miles away. These days, because of everything that happened, I now carry a pepper spray, and I'm actually a black belt, and I don't run from threats anymore, that's for sure. I work at a hospital, a town over from where I live, and I work as an environmental service, aka housekeeping. Every hospital worker has to wear a badge with a picture, first name, and your department on it. I'm also a 5'2" girl, if this matters. So, I used to park out the front of our hospital instead of our designated parking space because, 1, it was more lit out in the front, and 2, it just seemed easier. I now park in the back in our designated area and walk out with a co-worker who leaves at the same time that I do, though. When I get to work, it's still early evening, so around 4ish I'd say, and normally we have a few people outside and inside our waiting and wheelchair area, and you'll occasionally get a few, "Can you help me with this?" or "Do you know what floor so-and-so is?" So people are coming up to you because you're wearing scrubs and have a badge, and it isn't uncommon or weird at all. Except for this one time. I got to work a little early so I could eat before clocking in and getting right into work. I'm walking across this little crosswalk from the parking lot to the entrance when I get, "Hey miss, could you help me with something?" I turn around and see a decently dressed man in his mid-30s at best. I say, "Sure, what can I help you with?" He says, "My wife is on the 3rd floor, but I can't figure out what entrance to use." I say, "Sure, you'll want to use this one because the one all the way around to the left is for the emergency room and the one all the way across to the right is for the physical therapy and the senior center." He says, "Okay, thanks, and what time do the doors lock?" And I tell him 8. At this point, he nodded and just walked through the doors. I didn't think much of it, other than his wife was on the 3rd floor and he really should have known what door to use, especially since it had main entrance on the front, but I told my shift manager, who then radioed security, to maybe just keep an eye out for any weirdness. I finish my shift, and it's about midnight when I finally get outside the doors and halfway to the crosswalk when I hear my name, "It's good to see you." I turn my head to see the same guy from earlier on the bench outside. I give a polite nod and continue on my way to my car while unlocking my phone and getting my shift manager's office phone number up and ready to call. "Hey, I want to talk to you. Come and chat." Sorry, it's late and I have people up and waiting for me at home. Sorry. Wait, do you live around here?" I ignored him at this point and just continued to walk as fast as I could without running, and that's when I hear him speed up a little bit to catch up with me. "Come on, you're a pretty girl and I'm a decent guy. Why wouldn't you want to chat?" After that sentence, I'm about a foot or so away from my car and I push my automatic lock and swing my purse off my shoulder so I can just chuck it into my car and slam myself in and get away from the dude. "Hey!" I slam my purse in and then slam myself in, all the while locking my doors and slamming my key in and getting ready to leave when he reaches my car and slaps his hands on my window. "Hey, that's not cool. Let's just chat." I'm done talking to this guy at this point, and I'm seriously just ready to go home, so I rev my car a little to let him know that if he isn't moving, I'm running over his foot, and good thing that he can limp to the ER and explain how his foot was run over. I pull my car out of work and slowly one more time rev my engine so that he knows that I'm not fucking around. And he steps back and I pull up through a few parking spaces before speeding out and getting onto the road. The drive home was spent on the phone with my shift manager, who was radioing security to see if he was still out there and if they could still see him anywhere else on the location. They couldn't, but they checked the cameras back and saw him following me and then me leaving, and about 2 minutes later, him leaving as well. The next was spent with security and them telling me that they're going to forward this to the police and to please use our designated parking space and to call if I see him in the building on my shift or when coming in and out of work. This happened a couple of years ago, but I feel like I'm ready to talk about it. So, in 2016, I had just turned 18 and was in my second semester of community college. I was lucky to get to take a few specialized classes that were requirements for my major too. These classes required me to drive about 45 minutes every Monday, Wednesday and Friday to the main campus of my community college system. That's relevant because I was going to a town that I didn't know much about, and I didn't know anyone who lived there too. But there was a man in my class named Eddie. He was a big guy in his late 40s. I'm 5'0", and at the time was about 130 pounds, which is just to say that I was pretty small and defenseless. We spent a lot of time in the lab for these classes too, and he was stationed right across from me. I was a bit more naive and unsuspecting at the time and wanted to be nice, so I talked with him and my other classmates quite a bit, and was a lot friendlier to him than I would have been nowadays. He started being over-friendly to me and would just stand too close and ask too many personal questions, if you catch my drift. He'd flirt with me in class too, to the point that it seemed to make other people uncomfortable to watch. He also started staring at me a lot, with an intense look that honestly just scared me. Of course, me being young and not wanting to hurt his feelings, I decided to just ignore it as best as I could, and I told my boyfriend about it, but again, Eddie hadn't actually done anything to me, so there wasn't a whole lot that I felt like I could do. So a few weeks after that started, all of us were hanging out in a small break room type area, studying for an exam in our next class, which was about 30 minutes away. I was sitting at one table just chatting with some middle-aged women in my class, and Eddie was at the next table over just messing with his phone. I announced that I was going to get something from the vending machine and stood up, and as I did, he tried, and failed, to discreetly turn his phone toward me and snap pictures of me as I walked to the machine. Mind you, I was getting my drink and was bent over at the time to pick it up. I realized what was going on as I was walking back to my seat, with him still taking photos, and I shot him a look. He put his phone away and just sat there staring at me. I was trying to look pissed, but honestly, I was just really freaked out. I excused myself from the table and called my boyfriend near in tears, telling him what happened. He was angry and said that I need to tell someone, but I said no, I didn't want to make a scene. He tried to comfort me as much as he could, but I had to go to class soon afterwards. Our last class finished at about 9 p.m, and since it was January, it was completely dark out when we walked to our cars. I was actually texting one of my guy friends about what had happened when Eddie walked up to my car, stopped for a second, and looked at me through my windshield, then slowly just kept walking, watching me through my driver's side window the whole time. He was parked nowhere near me, and the wind chill was below zero at this point, so he had to have made a point to walk to my car like that. I was terrified, and with my hand shaking, I started my car and drove home as fast as I could, calling my boyfriend on the way and crying. After that, I decided I needed to talk to my professor about what was going on. I was so nervous, but I asked her for the next week if I could just talk to her privately when class was over. We went to her office and I told her about Eddie and what he'd done and how he acted weird toward me. She had told me that she had noticed that I tensed up and went quiet when he got close to me, and that had noticed him paying a lot of attention to me, and told me she believed me about the pictures. She was honestly amazing with how she handled it. She promised me that she would move things around where I'd be away from him in the lab, and asked if I wanted her to talk to him about it too. I said no, that I didn't want to make him angry, and she said that she respected that, but she was going to have the security guard stand at the door and watch me go to my car every night, and that she'd tell the program director what was going on, but Eddie wouldn't know that I talked to her. By the time that we had got done, it had been about 30 minutes at this point since class had ended, and she offered me to walk me outside. I'm glad that she did too, because when we came out of the elevator to the first floor, Eddie was sitting in the foyer, alone. Everyone else had gone home at this point, and my blood, it ran cold, but I tried to act as normal as I could. He seemed as surprised to see our professor there as she was to see him. She asked why he was still here, and he said that he noticed my car was still parked out front and wanted to make sure that I didn't have to walk out by myself. I'm pretty sure that I was pale as a ghost at this point, but my professor gave him a look that I couldn't read and said not to worry. She was walking me to my car, and from now on the security guard will be there every night. He said that that was good and quickly said goodnight and left. It still chills me to think about what could have happened if my professor didn't walk me down to my car that night. I have no idea what he's capable of doing, but after this, she rearranged our seating and made sure that we never grouped together, and I started making sure I walked out to my car at the same time as a few other women in my class. The security guard was usually in the foyer, and we only had a couple of months left of class, so there weren't really any other incidences, but I still caught him staring at me sometimes, and to be quite frank, he looked like pure rage. When I was 15, I enrolled in a program that allowed high schoolers to take classes at the local community college. The credits earned there would apply as both high school and college credits. My first semester as a part of this program, I took a basic English and creative writing type class, and I was by far the youngest student. My classmates found out pretty quickly that I was a minor too, and were curious why and how I was attending college classes while still in high school. I explained the situation to them, and they were all very nice and accommodating towards me, and I ended up exchanging instant messenger screen names with quite a few of them. One of my classmates to whom I gave my info to was a 19-year-old guy named Nick. He was a bit of an odd duck, to say the least. Short and chubby with a sparse beard, and he frequently wore a black cape lined with red on the inside to class. He seemed into darker stuff and was a huge fan of vampires and Satanism and listened to some intense music and all that. I didn't really mind at the time, to be honest. I was mostly just relieved to have made some friends despite my young age. He began to instant message me on a regular basis pretty quickly too. The classroom that we were in had computers for each of us, so Nick would often message me during class on those computers. At first, things seemed to be quite normal. We talked about our interests and hobbies, family, homework, assignments, and gossiped about our other classmates and whatnot. Pretty soon, though, Nick started bringing up some awkward topics that, as a naive 15-year-old girl, made me uncomfortable. Nick talked about how pretty he thought I was, and would often tell me that I looked a few years older than I was. To be fair, I was quite tall for a 15-year-old, and said that I acted mature for my age. He asked if I had a boyfriend, and when I told him I did, he seemed upset and disappointed. He said if I broke up with my boyfriend and dated him, he would treat me like his vampire princess. He told me that he wanted to kiss me and touch me everywhere, and that he hoped that I would let him bite my neck. I politely yet firmly turned him down every time that he brought it up, but he just didn't seem to get the hint. Since I was too young for a driver's license, my mum had to pick me up from college campus and drive me home. Due to her schedule, I usually had to wait for her to pick me up outside the building my class was held in. Most of the time, I would have to wait about half an hour, and Nick started following me out of class and would often wait with me until my mum pulled up. He would pressure me for personal info and trash talk my current boyfriend. He commented that my boyfriend was probably cheating on me, so I should dump him preemptively. When my mum finally pulled up, I would breathe a sigh of relief and just jump into the car. Online, Nick began to get more aggressive too. Anytime he messaged me, he would start talking about my body in just really inappropriate ways for a 15-year-old. I would repeatedly tell him that I didn't like what he was saying, but no matter how many times I tried to steer the conversation away, he would always bring it back to the dirty talk. He told me that he didn't mind that I was mostly flat-chested, stating that he didn't need more than a handful. He told me that I should wear tighter clothing to class so that he could get a better image of what I looked like naked. He mentioned that he frequently fantasized about doing stuff to me while in class, and specifically mentioned bending me over the computer desks. When I was at home, I would refuse to respond to his messages if he took it too far. But when we were in class, I had no excuse as to why I wasn't messaging him back. He would sit next to me in class every day too, and would send me messages and then just stare at me until I replied. If I didn't, he would get upset and his messages would become more hostile. He would say things like, "Why aren't you responding to me? You know I can see you ignoring me. I thought that you were too young and pure to turn into one of those bitchy sluts, but I guess I was wrong." The messages would pop up one after the other until I replied, and I would often cave and say, "Sorry, I was just paying attention to the teacher and didn't see your messages." Of course, he'd immediately change his tune at this point and then start right back up with his twisted idea of a romantic conversation. I felt like there was no escaping his barrage of sexual commentary, and I vowed to just stick it out and make it to the end of the semester, and I thought if I get through the class that I could easily avoid him on campus in the spring. But everything came to a head towards the end of the full semester. Nick sat next to me in every class and messaged me constantly, calling me just weird pet names in front of other people, and would always try to be in physical contact with me. He'd put his arm around my shoulders and always wanted to hug me. It made me excruciatingly uncomfortable, but I was too shy and nervous to ask him to stop. I would shrug his arm off my shoulders and try to stick to high fives, and when he hugged me, I kept my hips as far away from his as possible. I even told one of the mentors at my youth group that there was someone at my college making me feel uncomfortable. At the time, I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, so I asked my youth leader if I could forward him the parts of our online conversations that I thought were the most inappropriate. My youth leader's reaction quickly made me realize that this was serious, and he explained that what Nick was doing was both extremely inappropriate and also potentially illegal. He asked if I could keep him updated on the situation and to send him any more questionable messages. A couple of days later, Nick messaged me. For some reason, on that particular day, he was just acting extremely forward. He made several of the usual comments about my looks and body, and then started to say how frustrating it was that I was so hot at a young age. He told me that I was too beautiful and that it drove him crazy seeing me in person. Then he said something that just sent chills down my spine. He told me, "You're so sexy and gorgeous that I'd probably still fuck you, even if you were dead." He then went on to describe in great detail how he had this fantasy of having sex with a girl who either was unconscious or freshly dead. And I mean, in great detail. I was absolutely horrified, obviously, and just sat there staring at the barrage of the messages as they popped up. After a few minutes, I was able to snap myself out of my terrified stupor and just immediately blocked him. I forwarded the messages to my youth leader, who became extremely incensed, and he urged me to tell my parents or the campus police so that they could help keep him away from me. He told me that this could be considered a threat and he wanted me to be safe. He seemed so afraid for me that it actually scared me even more, and I told him that I was thinking about telling someone and then signed off instant messenger. Unfortunately, I was young and stupid and did none of the things that he suggested. I finished the semester and avoided Nick like the plague. No small task, let me tell you. But I begged my mum to show up early so that I could leave class and jump right in the car, and the first time I did so, she looked behind me and said, "Oh, hey, it's your little friend." I turned to see Nick standing outside the classroom building, wearing his black cape and staring blatantly at me. The look on his face was just one of cold and furious hatred. I ducked down and shouted, "Please drive, Mum." But my mother looked at me, concerned, and then put the pedal to the floor. I did eventually give my mum a shortened explanation of what happened, leaving out some of the more grotesque details. She made a point to show up before my class ended every day and waited right outside of my building so I could run out and hop into the passenger side of the car. Fortunately, after he followed me outside a few more times, he just seemed to give up. He didn't try to talk to me in class and didn't follow me outside anymore, and I did catch him staring at me a few times in class though, but in general, he seemed to take the hint and just backed off. After that class ended, I never saw or heard from him again, and for that, I'm truly grateful. I don't know whatever happened to Vampire Nick, but I sure hope that his dreams, they're never fulfilled.